The saturated phenomenon, in its generative givenness, consists of four figures: the event, the icon, the flesh, and the idol. The number 4 is not arrived at by happenstance. These four cases invert the four categories of the understanding developed by Immanuel Kant, and less explicitly connect to Aristotle's four causes and Martin Heidegger's fourfold. For Heidegger, the fourfold constitutes things in their comprehensive unity. Such will be the case as well for the Thanatonic phenomenon in its parasitic givenness, whereby we discover another fourfold, in this case trauma, the evil eye, the foreign body, and the abject. A consistent logic emerges across the four figures and, when gathered, establish a comprehensive unity forming the phenomenological basis for evil itself. Like the four horsemen who serve as heralds for the destruction of the world, these proposed cases beckon the destruction of our life world, the Lebenswelt. That destruction manifests in being shattered, in the fracturing, receding, and dispersion of horizons and identity. This phrase, being shattered, characterizes the violent burst of the Thanatonic, leaving in its wake irreparable, desultory, and indistinguishable fragments. Like the phrase, being given, it speaks to a fait accompli, having already been given or shattered, and attests to a prior moment whereby the shattered or given comes to be. Being shattered identifies, like those determinations of givenness previously described, the unpredictable landing of the Thanatonic event, whose impact bursts and explodes upon the screen or prism of the receiver. The Thanatonic happens as an incident to me in such a way that it cannot be grasped, but rather compels me to accommodate myself to it. Chapter 3 considers the first of these four figures, the event of trauma. As an event, it shares characteristics with those events associated with a generative givenness, such as birth, love, and revelation, arriving as irrevocable, unforeseeable, and undetermined. However, divergences are noted in several key respects. This contrast is sharpened when considering the erotic event and its distinct temporality. Trauma introduces a time in which the future is no longer determined by an expectant hope born from the elsewhere of the beloved, nor the present what is made present by the elsewhere of the beloved, nor the past, a time as what forbids repetition for having been where the beloved was first encountered as an event. Rather, time becomes dismembered as the future disappears and the past ceaselessly and senselessly intrudes upon the present, leaving a shattered and cornered self. Whereas the erotic forbids repetition, trauma evokes a compulsion to repeat. It parasitizes other events. It incessantly returns us to the scene of the crime by selecting and imposing a demand upon other spaces, times, and actors to conform to the parameters of a prior event. Consequently, the self is unable to phenomenalize future events on their own terms, and instead their excess is compressed and appropriated by the preceding trauma. Finally, whereas the event is described as evoking surprise and amazement, trauma evokes terror and despair. Terror reveals me to myself and exposing me to the abyss of my own impotence and death. Despair arrives in the collapse of my possibilities as I'm left immobile, diminishing the capacity to receive and convert excess into manifestation. I'm rendered a pure subject, completely subjected to the time of trauma without being able to appropriate myself in my singularity. This collapse of possibilities wrought by trauma leaves me aphasic, not only in resisting every possible signification, but also in wrenching me from the chain of signifiers that makes meaning possible. Chapter 4 begins with a discussion of two contrasting approaches to a phenomenology of the gaze. One of them, encountered as the icon of the face, calls forth from its own horizon and individuates the self who assumes the role of a witness. As an erotic phenomenon, the iconic face of the beloved bestows upon the self the singular identity of lover, offering a meaning or a signification to the self's erotic intuition. It reveals itself to me in giving me a meaning and horizon not of my own, and yet comes to centrally define me. Another look can be described, exemplified by the medicalized gaze and panopticon, as described by Foucault, the voyeuristic gaze, as in Sartre, and Abject, situated in the scopic field, as described by Lacan. Its avatar is the evil eye, offering a malevolent look that harms the one who falls under its gaze. It's ubiquitously discovered in literary works, such as when Tolkien in The Lord of the Rings writes the following words describing the transformation of the story's antagonist. There he took up again his great ring in Barad-dûr, and dwelt there, dark and silent, until he wrought himself a new guise, an image of malice and hatred made visible, and the eye of Sauron, the terrible, few could endure. Like the icon, the evil eye arrives from elsewhere, arresting, detaining, and immobilizing, evoking an anamorphosis that requires an accommodation to the horizon it imposes. In contrast, it delivers a counter-experience that induces its own erasure. It gives and simultaneously dissimulates the horizon it confers upon me. Not only does it dissimulate its own horizon, it closes off existing frontiers within me. It renders me agnostic as what was previously accessible becomes unknown. Rather than evoking an ethical or loving response, it commands, "Pay no attention to me," evoking a forgetful appropriation so to obfuscate the manner by which it masters me and lords over me with its constricting excess. In being assumed by the self as oneself, the self forgets itself and thereby becomes both instrument and author of its own self-subjugation. Singularity is then diminished, leaving behind only a homogenized remnant of a depleted, shattered being. Chapter 5 presents an alternative to the objective body and phenomenological body, establishing and describing what Freud called der Fremdkörper, the foreign body. We begin by turning to neurology, psychoanalysis, and theology to consider some exemplars. The alien limb is a condition in which an extremity initiates seemingly purposeful activity independent of the patient's will. The superego functions as an incorporated agency, manifesting as an intrusive voice, unbidden symptoms, and alien memories. Sin presents as a thorn in the flesh, leading me to will against my own will. Like eroticized flesh, the foreign body marks the crossing of an autoaffection with a heteroaffection. Rather than preserve an incommensurable distance, crossed but never collapsed, the foreign body invades my lived space and excorporates my flesh, functioning as an interiorized exteriority, both alien and inextricable to me, inaugurating an absolute and distanceless proximity. It reveals not another world to me, but the loss of the world I inhabited. In this loss, I undergo a collapse of my possibilities previously expressed in the I can of the body. Instead, an apraxia is acquired, expressed as the I cannot, an asthenia expressed as the I want not, and a compulsion expressed as the I cannot not. In Chapter 6, we'll encounter the abject. Whereas the foreign body forms an interiorized exteriority, the abject appears as an exteriorized interiority. Like the idol, it arrives as an excess of visibility, placing an unbearable weight upon the measure of my gaze. One encounters it in the corporeal as death, disease, and deformity. It also appears as the monstrous and alien other. This chapter will examine descriptions of the abject found in psychoanalysis, philosophy, and the arts. Rather than lead to bedazzlement and eventually to vanity, however, it evokes horror and disgust before my unacknowledged monstrosity. By inducing amnesia amnesia, I meet a disowned familiarity as a strange, threatening foreignness that converts my horror and disgust into a fascinated hatred. Finally, like the icon in its relation to the other three saturated phenomena, the abject displays characteristics shared by the other three cases of the Thanatonic. It arrives as a violence, as in trauma, imposes a threatening foreignness, as with the evil eye, and reveals a diminished corporeality, as with the foreign body. We will conclude the introduction in the next video, raising the following questions. First, what kind of self emerges from the being shattered in the encounter with the Thanatonic phenomenon? Second, what kind of society is formed when two or more of these selves are gathered in its name? Thank you for watching. You can leave a comment or question down below. And to support this channel, please subscribe. I'll see you next time.